The carriage stopped outside the church before Eleanor Whitmore was ready for it to stop. Her hands were cold inside her gloves, and her heart was beating so fast she thought everyone around her could hear it. She was not marrying a man she loved. She was marrying a man she had never spoken to in her life. Her father had died 3 months earlier, and with him went the last of the family's money. The house was mortgaged twice over. The servants had already left because there was nothing left to pay them. When the letter came from the estate of the Duke of Ashcombe, offering marriage between Eleanor and the Duke's younger brother, Julian Ashford, her mother had wept with relief before Eleanor had even finished reading it. "It is a solution," her mother said. "It is the only solution." Eleanor did not argue. There was nothing to argue with. A woman without money had very few choices, and refusing this one would only lead to a worse one. So she stood at the altar, in a borrowed white dress, looking at a man she did not know, and tried not to let her fear show on her face. Julian Ashford was tall, with dark hair, and eyes that seemed to study her longer than politeness required. He did not smile during the ceremony. He did not look away from her either. When the priest asked him to take her hand, he did so gently, as if she might break, and Eleanor felt something strange pass between them. It was not comfort. It was not desire. It felt like recognition, though she was certain they had never met. After the ceremony, there was no celebration, no music, no guests laughing over wine. Julian led her to his carriage in silence, and they rode for hours through the countryside without speaking. Eleanor watched the fields pass by the window, and wondered what kind of life waited for her at the end of this road. "You are wondering why I chose you," Julian said suddenly, breaking the silence. Eleanor turned to look at him. "I assumed it was arranged by our families. For money, for position." "That is what my brother believes," Julian said. "It is not the truth." "Then what is the truth?" He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes, something that looked almost like grief. "Not yet," he said. "You are not ready to hear it, and I am not ready to say it." Eleanor felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the cold outside. She wanted to press him further, but something in his expression told her it would do no good. She turned back to the window and said nothing more for the rest of the journey. The estate, when they arrived, was larger than she expected. A grand stone house sat at the end of a long drive, surrounded by gardens that had clearly once been beautiful and were now slightly overgrown, as though no one had cared for them properly in years. Julian helped her down from the carriage, his hand steady under hers, and led her inside. The housekeeper, a kind-faced woman named Margaret, greeted them at the door. "Welcome home, my lady," she said, and something in the way she said it, warm and familiar, made Eleanor feel even more like a stranger in her own life. That night, alone in the room she had been given, Eleanor tried to make sense of everything that had happened. She had married a man who spoke to her as though he already knew her, in a house that felt like it had been waiting for her arrival. She did not know what to make of it, and she was too exhausted to try. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, her dreams were full of questions she could not answer. The next morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through curtains that had been chosen, she would learn, in the exact shade of blue she had always loved and never told anyone about. It was the first of many small surprises that would make her wonder just how much her new husband already knew about her, and how he had come to know it. She rose and dressed carefully, unsure of what the day would bring, unsure of what kind of household she had married into, and entirely unsure of the man waiting for her downstairs. Whatever answers Julian Ashford was keeping from her, she was determined to find them, no matter how long it took or how much it cost her to learn the truth. Breakfast was laid out in a small sunlit room at the back of the house, and Eleanor found herself staring at the table before she even sat down. There was tea prepared exactly the way she liked it, with a small amount of honey and no milk. There was a plate of soft bread with butter, the same breakfast she had eaten every morning of her childhood, before her family's fortune had failed, and such simple comforts became rare. She had not told anyone in this household what she liked to eat. She had not told anyone anything at all. "Is something wrong?" Julian asked, entering the room behind her. "No," Eleanor said carefully. "Everything is exactly right. That is what troubles me." He said nothing to that, only took his seat across from her and began to eat in silence. Eleanor watched him closely, trying to read something in his face, but he had the same careful composure he had worn since the wedding, like a man holding something heavy, and refusing to let anyone see the weight of it. Over the following days, the small signs continued. She found a shelf of books in the library that matched her exact taste, novels she had loved as a girl, and poetry collections she had never mentioned to a living soul since her father's illness took over their household. She found her favorite flowers, white roses with the faintest blush of pink, growing in a corner of the garden that seemed to have been planted with particular care. Every comfort she might have wished for seemed to already exist in this house, waiting for her, as though someone had spent years preparing it. She began to ask the staff questions, carefully, trying not to seem as unsettled as she felt. Margaret, the housekeeper, was kind but evasive, always finding a reason to change the subject. The younger maids seemed nervous whenever Eleanor brought up the history of the house, or asked how long certain rooms had been prepared, or who had chosen the furnishings. One afternoon, while walking the halls alone, she noticed a corridor she had not yet explored, tucked behind the main staircase and separated by a heavy wooden door. She tried the handle. It was locked. "That wing is not in use," Margaret said, appearing suddenly behind her, her voice tight. "There is nothing there for you, my lady." "Whose rooms are they?" Eleanor asked. Margaret's face went pale. "You should ask his lordship that question, not me." That night, Eleanor sat across from Julian at dinner, and finally asked him directly. "There is a locked wing in this house. Margaret will not tell me what is inside it. I would like you to tell me instead." Julian's hand stilled over his glass. For a moment, he did not answer, and the silence between them stretched long enough that Eleanor began to think he would refuse entirely. "It is a part of my past," he said finally, "a part I am not ready to share with you yet." "You keep saying that," Eleanor said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Not yet, not ready. I am your wife, Julian. I sleep under this roof. I eat at this table, and I do not even know why you married me." "I know," he said quietly, "and I am sorry for the position that puts you in. But some truths, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. I need to be certain the time is right before I give you this one." Eleanor pushed back from the table, frustration and fear tangled together in her chest. "Then I will find out on my own," she said, and left the room before he could answer. She did not sleep well that night, her mind turning over every strange comfort in the house, every careful preparation, every silence from her husband that felt heavier than any answer could have been. She was beginning to understand that her marriage was not built on politics or money at all. It was built on something far older, something that had started long before she had ever met Julian Ashford, and she intended to find out exactly what that was, whatever the cost. 3 days later, an opportunity presented itself. Julian was called away to attend to business on a distant part of the estate, and Margaret, who usually kept the keys close to her at all times, was occupied helping the younger staff prepare for an unexpected visit from a neighboring family. Eleanor found the ring of keys hanging, forgotten, on a hook near the kitchen door. Her heart pounded as she made her way toward the locked wing, the keys heavy and cold in her palm. She told herself she could still turn back, that whatever waited behind that door might be better left undiscovered. But the uncertainty had become unbearable, a constant weight pressing against every quiet moment of her new life, and she could not carry it any longer without answers. The door opened with a soft groan, revealing a corridor thick with dust and shadow, the curtains drawn tight against the daylight. Eleanor stepped inside, her candle throwing a small circle of light against walls lined with portraits she did not recognize. She moved slowly, studying each one, until she reached a door at the end of the hall and pushed it open. Inside was a bedroom, untouched for what looked like years, but clearly once loved. A woman's belongings still sat upon the dressing table, hairbrushes and small jewelry boxes arranged with care, as though their owner might return at any moment. Above the fireplace hung a large portrait, and when Eleanor lifted her candle to look at it properly, her breath caught in her throat. The woman in the painting looked remarkably like her. The same dark hair, the same shape of the eyes, the same set of the mouth. It was not an exact likeness, but close enough to send a cold shiver down Eleanor's spine. She stepped closer, searching for a name, and found a small brass plate at the base of the frame, engraved with delicate letters. Charlotte Aldridge. Eleanor did not know the name, but something about it felt important, as though it were a key to everything she had been searching for since her wedding day. She moved to the writing desk beside the window, and found a stack of letters tied together with faded ribbon, the paper yellowed with age. She untied them with trembling hands and began to read. The letters were love letters, written in Julian's own hand, addressed to this woman, Charlotte. They spoke of a devotion so deep it made Eleanor's chest ache to read it, promises of a future together, plans for a life neither of them would apparently ever get to live. The final letter in the stack was different from the others, shorter, more desperate, written in a hand that shook with what looked like grief or fear. Before she could read further, she heard footsteps in the corridor behind her, quick and heavy, and she turned to find Julian standing in the doorway, his face white with a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like pain. "You should not be in here," he said, his voice low and unsteady. "Who was she?" Eleanor asked, holding up the letters. "Who is Charlotte Aldridge, and why do I look like her?" Julian crossed the room in 3 quick strides, and gently took the letters from her hands, his fingers trembling as he did. He stood there for a long moment, staring down at the papers, before finally lifting his eyes to meet hers. "She was the woman I loved, before I ever knew you existed," he said. "And she died because of my brother." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Eleanor felt her legs go weak, and she reached for the edge of the desk to steady herself. Whatever she had expected to find behind that locked door, it was not this. Not a dead woman who wore her own face. Not a husband whose heart had already been broken once by a tragedy connected to his own family. "Tell me everything," she said. "Now. No more waiting. No more not yet." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving over her face, as though searching for the strength to finally say what he had been carrying alone for so long. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, with an old and unhealed sorrow. "Charlotte was to be my wife," he said. "We were engaged in secret, because my brother, the Duke, did not approve. He had plans for me, a marriage that would serve his ambitions, and Charlotte was not part of those plans. When he discovered our engagement, he ended it in the cruelest way he knew how. She died not long after, and I have spent every year since trying to understand exactly what role my brother played in her death, and I have never had the proof I needed to make him answer for it." "And me?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you choose me?" Julian stepped closer, close enough that she could see the raw honesty in his eyes. "Not because you resemble her, though I will not pretend that resemblance did not catch my attention when I first learned of you. I chose you because of who you are, Eleanor. Because of a connection to my brother's past that he does not know you carry. A connection that could finally give me the proof I have spent years searching for." Eleanor stared at him, the pieces beginning to form a shape she did not yet fully understand, but one that filled her with a fear, far greater than anything she had felt on her wedding day. "What connection?" she asked. "What do I have to do with any of this?" Julian's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might retreat again into silence. But then he took a breath, steadying himself, and reached for her hand. "There is more to tell you," he said. "More than I can explain in a single evening. But I promise you this, Eleanor, you are not a replacement for anyone. You are not a shadow of a woman I lost. You are the key to justice I have waited years to find, and I am only sorry it has taken me this long to trust you with the truth." Outside, the wind picked up against the windows of the old wing, rattling the glass, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Eleanor looked down at the portrait of Charlotte Aldridge one final time, then back at her husband, and felt the ground of her new life shift beneath her feet, revealing a much darker and more dangerous story than she had ever imagined marrying into. She did not yet know how deeply she was already tangled in it, or how much danger that connection would soon bring to her door, but she understood, with sudden and complete certainty, that there would be no turning back from this moment. Whatever truth Julian Ashford had chosen to protect her from, it was already too late to protect her from it any longer, and the real story of her marriage was only just beginning. Julian did not sleep that night, and neither did Eleanor. They sat together in the small library long after the rest of the house had gone quiet, a single candle burning low between them, while he finally told her the whole truth he had carried alone for years. Charlotte Aldridge had been the daughter of a modest merchant family, far below the standing the Duke of Ashcombe expected for his brother's marriage. Julian had loved her anyway, deeply and without hesitation, and the two of them had planned to marry quietly before his brother could interfere. But the Duke had discovered the engagement through a servant loyal to him, and within weeks, Charlotte's family had been ruined, their business destroyed, through debts that appeared from nowhere. their name dragged through scandal that had no true foundation. Charlotte herself had fallen ill soon after, weakened by grief and hardship, and had died before Julian could find any way to save her or her family. "I always believed my brother's hand was behind it," Julian said, his voice low and controlled, though Eleanor could see the effort it cost him to keep it steady. "But I could never prove it. He is careful. Everything he does passes through other hands before it reaches its target, so that his own are never seen to be dirtied." "And what does this have to do with me?" Eleanor asked again, gently this time, sensing that the answer mattered more than anything else he had said so far. Julian reached into a drawer of the writing desk and withdrew a small folded document, its edges worn soft with age and handling. "Your mother," he said, "was born into a family with a legal claim tied to lands my brother now holds. A claim that was buried, quietly, through a false marriage record, generated at the time your grandfather passed away. If that record can be proven false, the Duke's hold over a significant portion of his fortune collapses, and with it, much of the power he has used to hurt people like Charlotte and her family for years." Eleanor felt the world tilt slightly around her. "My mother never spoke of any such claim." "She may not know," Julian said. "It was buried before you were born. I have spent 3 years searching for the proof, and when I finally traced the true line of your family, I knew I had found not just proof, but a chance to end my brother's reach for good. I sought your hand in marriage because it would place you, and the claim you carry, under my protection, where my brother could not touch either of you without exposing himself in the process. So I was a strategy," Eleanor said quietly, hurt creeping into her voice despite herself. "You were a strategy at first," Julian admitted. "I will not lie to you about that, but strategy is not what kept me awake these past weeks, wondering how you were settling into a house full of strangers. Strategy did not make me choose the exact shade of blue for your curtains, or find the poetry books you loved as a girl. I learned enough about you during my search to admire you long before I ever stood beside you at the altar, Eleanor. What began as a plan has become something I did not expect, and did not know how to tell you, because I feared you would see only the plan, and never the man standing behind it." Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception, and finding none, only the same raw honesty she had seen in the locked wing hours earlier. Whatever anger she wanted to hold on to began to soften, replaced by something more complicated, something that felt dangerously close to trust. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Julian said, "we must move carefully. My brother does not yet know I have found the proof, or that I have married the one person whose bloodline can undo his claim. But he is not a foolish man, and he will notice soon enough that something has changed. When he does, he will not hesitate to act against us both." He was right to worry. Within the week, word arrived that the Duke of Ashcombe intended to pay a visit to the estate, an unannounced visit that Julian said had never happened before in all the years he had lived apart from his brother. Eleanor watched the household transform with quiet tension as the staff prepared for his arrival, Margaret's face pale and drawn, the younger maid speaking in hushed voices whenever the Duke's name was mentioned. He arrived on a gray afternoon, stepping down from a carriage far grander than Julian's, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to make the very air around him feel colder. Eleanor stood beside her husband in the entrance hall and felt an instinctive wariness the moment the Duke's eyes settled upon her, cold and calculating, studying her the way a man might study an opponent across a chessboard. "So this is the wife," the Duke said, his voice smooth and pleasant in a way that did nothing to hide the sharpness beneath it. "You did not tell me she was so lovely, brother, though I confess, the resemblance to a certain unfortunate young woman from your past is rather striking. I am sure that is only a coincidence." Eleanor felt Julian's hand tighten briefly around hers, a silent warning to remain calm. "Eleanor is my wife," he said evenly. "Nothing more needs to be said about it." The Duke's smile did not reach his eyes. "Of course," he said. "I only came to offer my congratulations in person, and to see for myself the woman who has finally convinced my brother to settle down." His gaze moved over Eleanor once more, slow and deliberate, and she understood in that moment that he was not here for congratulations at all. He was here to gather information, to search for whatever advantage he could find, and she had a terrible feeling he would not need to search very long before he found it. That evening, over a dinner thick with careful conversation and unspoken threats, The Duke asked Eleanor questions about her family, with a casualness that did not match the intensity in his eyes. Where had her mother been born? What had become of her grandfather's estate? Whether she had ever seen any old family papers. Eleanor answered as vaguely as she could manage, aware that Julian was watching the exchange with barely concealed tension, but she could see, in the small, satisfied curve of the Duke's mouth, that he was already beginning to suspect the truth. He left the following morning without further incident, but the visit had changed everything. Julian paced the length of the library long after the Duke's carriage had disappeared down the drive, his composure finally cracking under the weight of what was coming. "He suspects something," Julian said. "I saw it in his face. He will begin searching for the proof himself now, and if he finds it before we can use it, he will destroy it, and any chance we have of exposing him along with it. Then we must move faster than he does," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. Whatever fear she carried, it was matched now by a growing determination, born not just from the danger to herself, but from the memory of Charlotte's portrait, and the quiet tragedy that had unfolded in that locked and forgotten room. "There is a solicitor in the city," Julian said slowly, "a man who handled the original transfer of your grandfather's lands. If the false marriage record was created through him, he may still hold the true documents somewhere in his private records, kept as insurance against the very man who forced him to falsify them in the first place. It is a risk to seek him out, but it may be our only chance to secure proof before my brother reaches him first." Eleanor did not hesitate. "Then we go to him, together." Julian studied her for a long moment, something like admiration softening the worry in his expression. "You understand what you are agreeing to. If my brother learns what we are doing, he will not simply threaten us. He has ruined families before, Eleanor. He will not stop at ruining ours." "I understand," she said, "but I have already lost everything once, when my father died, and left us with nothing. I would rather lose it fighting for the truth than lose it hiding from a man like your brother for the rest of my life." They left for the city 2 days later, traveling under the cover of a supposed visit to distant relatives, though Eleanor suspected the Duke's spies were already watching every movement made from the estate. The solicitor, an elderly man named Charles Fenwick, received them with visible nervousness the moment Julian explained the purpose of their visit, glancing repeatedly toward the door, as though he expected the Duke's men to appear at any moment. "I have waited a long time for someone to ask me this question," Fenwick admitted quietly, once he was satisfied they had not been followed. "I kept the true documents, hidden where the Duke could never think to look, because I always believed the day would come when someone would need them. I only hoped I would live long enough to see it." He led them to a hidden compartment behind a false wall in his private office, and withdrew a small collection of aged papers, their seals still intact, proving beyond any doubt that Eleanor's grandfather had held a legitimate and unbroken claim to lands the Duke of Ashcombe had spent decades falsely calling his own. Eleanor's hands trembled as she held the proof of her family's true history, finally understanding the full weight of what Julian had been searching for, and the danger that now surrounded them both. They had barely left the solicitor's office when a carriage bearing the Duke's crest appeared at the end of the street, and Eleanor felt her heart stop for a single terrible moment, before Julian pulled her quickly into a side alley, out of view. Whatever safety they had believed they still possessed had clearly run out, and the true battle between Julian Ashford and his brother the Duke was about to begin in earnest, with Eleanor now standing directly in the center of it. They did not return to the estate directly. Julian insisted they take a longer, winding route through the countryside, doubling back twice to be certain no one followed. Eleanor sat pressed against him in the carriage, the hidden documents wrapped carefully inside her cloak, her mind racing through everything that had happened since that morning. She had entered the city as a woman searching for answers about her own past. She was leaving it as a woman who now held the power to destroy one of the most feared men in the country, and she understood, with a cold clarity, that such power came with a price. That price arrived sooner than she expected. When they finally reached the estate late that night, Margaret met them at the door, with a face so pale it seemed drained of all color, her hands twisting together in front of her apron. "There has been a visitor," she said, "while you were away. A man came asking questions about my lady's family, about her mother, about papers he believed might be kept here. He did not give his name, but I recognized his manner. He works for the Duke." Julian's expression darkened. "What did he find?" Nothing, my lord. I made certain of that. But he searched the study, and he was not gentle about it. Margaret hesitated, then added, "He also said something before he left. He said his lordship sends his regards, and hopes the lady is settling in comfortably, given how quickly circumstances can change for young brides." Eleanor felt a chill settle deep into her bones. It was not a threat spoken plainly, but it did not need to be. The Duke was letting them know he was watching, that he understood far more than he had admitted during his visit, and that he was prepared to act the moment he judged it necessary. Over the following days, the pressure only increased. A letter arrived from Eleanor's mother, her handwriting shaky with distress, explaining that a man claiming to represent the Duke's interests had visited her modest lodgings and hinted, in careful and threatening language, that her daughter's marriage could easily be annulled on grounds of fraud if certain family matters were not left undisturbed. Another letter came for Julian from a business associate, informing him that a long-standing arrangement had suddenly been withdrawn, an arrangement Julian had relied upon to fund the small independence he maintained apart from his brother's fortune. It was clear the Duke intended to strangle them slowly, cutting away every source of safety and support before making any final, decisive move. "He is trying to frighten us into silence," Julian said one evening, staring into the fire with an exhaustion that had begun to show clearly on his face. "If we come forward with the documents now, before we have secured protection for your mother and for the staff here who have helped us, he will retaliate against them first, to punish us for defying him." "Then we need allies," Eleanor said. "Someone with enough standing to stand against him publicly. Someone he cannot simply threaten into silence the way he has threatened everyone else." Julian was quiet for a long moment before he spoke again. "There is a judge, an old friend of my father's, who has long suspected my brother's dealings, but never had sufficient proof to act. If we can bring the documents to him directly, under protection, he may be willing to move against my brother through proper legal channels before the Duke has any chance to destroy the evidence or silence us first." It was a dangerous plan, requiring them to travel once more, this time with proof that could not fall into the wrong hands under any circumstance. Eleanor insisted on going with him, refusing to be left behind at the estate, where she would only wait in fear, not knowing what was happening, or whether Julian would return to her at all. They departed at dawn 2 days later, taking a route through the forest paths rather than the main road, hoping to avoid whatever watchers the Duke might have posted along the usual way. Eleanor rode close beside Julian, the documents secured against her chest beneath her cloak, her senses sharpened by a fear she had never known before, a fear that made every sound in the trees around them feel like a threat waiting to reveal itself. It was near midday when the attack came. 2 riders emerged suddenly from the trees ahead, blocking the narrow path, their faces covered and their intentions unmistakable in the way they moved. Julian pulled Eleanor's horse close to his own, shouting for her to ride, but the men were already closing in, cutting off any clear path of escape. Eleanor's heart pounded as she watched Julian confront the first rider, forcing his horse between the attacker and herself, buying precious seconds while she searched desperately for any way through the trees. She remembered, suddenly, a narrow deer path she had noticed earlier, half hidden by low branches, and she urged her horse toward it, with a strength she did not know she possessed, calling for Julian to follow. He broke free just moments later, his coat torn and a shallow cut along his arm, but alive, and together they raced through the trees until the sounds of pursuit finally faded behind them. They did not stop until they reached a small inn several miles further along, where Julian insisted on binding his wound himself, refusing to let Eleanor see how deeply frightened the encounter had left him. "They were not trying to kill us," he said quietly, once his breathing had steadied. "If they wanted us dead, we would already be dead. They wanted the documents. My brother is growing desperate, which means he understands exactly how dangerous the proof we carry truly is." "Then we cannot wait any longer," Eleanor said. "We finish this now, before he finds another chance to take what we have risked everything to protect." They reached the judge's residence the following afternoon, exhausted, and bearing the visible marks of their journey, but with the documents still safely in hand. The judge, a stern but fair-minded man named Alistair Grant, listened to their account with careful attention, examining the papers with the practiced eye of a man who had spent decades studying matters of law and inheritance. "This is a serious claim," he said finally, setting the documents down upon his desk. If genuine, and I have no reason to doubt Mr. Fenwick's seal upon them, this would indeed unravel a significant portion of the Duke's holdings and raise serious questions about how those holdings were obtained in the first place. But you must understand, moving against a man of his position will not be simple, and it will not be without consequence for either of you. We understand, Julian said. We are prepared for that. Grant studied them both for a long moment, something like respect entering his expression. Then I will begin the necessary proceedings immediately. Quietly at first, to prevent your brother from destroying evidence, or fleeing beyond reach, before the matter can be properly addressed. But I must warn you, once this becomes known, he will not go quietly. A man like the Duke of Ashcombe does not surrender power without a fight, and he will use every resource remaining to him before the end. Eleanor left the judge's residence with a strange mixture of relief and dread settling over her, aware that they had taken an irreversible step, and that whatever consequences followed would now be impossible to avoid. She glanced at Julian as they climbed back into the carriage, and saw in his face the same understanding, the same quiet resolve, and beneath it, a flicker of something warmer that had grown steadily between them through every danger they had faced together. "Whatever happens now," he said softly, taking her hand in his, "I am glad it is you standing beside me, Eleanor. Whatever began this marriage, I could not imagine facing what comes next with anyone else." Eleanor felt her chest tighten with an emotion she had not expected to find in a marriage that began in fear and obligation. Whatever the coming days held, she realized she no longer wished to face them without him, and that realization frightened her almost as much as the Duke's threats did. Word of the judge's investigation reached the Duke of Ashcombe faster than either Julian or Eleanor had hoped, and his response came swiftly and without hesitation. Within days, he summoned them both to his own estate, sending a formal invitation that carried the unmistakable weight of a command rather than a request. Julian wanted to refuse, fearing a trap, but Grant advised them to attend, insisting that a public refusal would only give the Duke grounds to claim they were hiding something, while a calm and open confrontation, witnessed by others, would strengthen their position considerably. The Duke's estate was even grander than Eleanor had imagined, its halls lined with portraits of ancestors whose stern faces seemed to watch her every step as she walked beside Julian into the great hall. The Duke waited for them there, seated in a high-backed chair like a man upon a throne. Several of his associates gathered around him, along with, to Eleanor's surprise, Judge Grant himself, standing near the window with an expression of careful neutrality. "So," the Duke said, rising slowly from his chair, "my brother has decided to make a public spectacle of family matters, best left private. I confess, I did not expect such boldness from you, Julian. Charlotte's death taught you nothing, it seems." The mention of Charlotte's name struck like a blow, and Eleanor saw Julian's jaw tighten with barely restrained anger. "Charlotte's death taught me everything," Julian said, his voice low and controlled. "It taught me exactly what you are capable of, and exactly how far you will go to protect what you have stolen." "Careful, brother," the Duke said, his tone still smooth but with an edge sharpening beneath it. "Accusations without proof are dangerous things to make in front of witnesses." "We have proof," Eleanor said, stepping forward before Julian could respond, her voice steadier than she felt. She withdrew the documents from beneath her cloak and held them out for the room to see. "Documents, proving my grandfather's legitimate claim to lands you have held under a falsified marriage record for over 20 years. Judge Grant has already reviewed them and confirmed their authenticity." The Duke's composed expression flickered, just for a moment, before he recovered himself. "Forgeries can be made to look authentic to those eager enough to believe them." "They are not forgeries," Grant said, finally stepping forward from the window. "I have compared them against the original solicitor's records, along with additional documentation confirming their provenance. The claim is legitimate, Your Grace, and I have already begun the formal process to have the matter reviewed by the proper courts. I came here today not merely as a witness, but to inform you personally, as a courtesy, before the proceedings become public." For a long moment, the great hall fell utterly silent, the weight of years of hidden schemes and quiet cruelty pressing down upon the room. Eleanor watched the Duke's face carefully, searching for any sign of what he might do next, aware that a man who had built his entire life upon control and manipulation would not surrender that control easily, whatever proof stood against him. "You think this ends things," the Duke said finally, his voice dropping into something colder and far more dangerous than his earlier smoothness. You think a few old papers and a sympathetic judge will unmake everything I have built. I have spent my life protecting this family's position, Julian, while you played at romance with merchants' daughters and now chase ghosts through my private affairs. Do not mistake my patience for weakness. I do not mistake anything about you, Julian said. I know exactly what you are, and exactly what you did to Charlotte, and to her family, and I no longer intend to let you hide behind position and fear. Whatever you do next, the truth is already beyond your reach. Judge Grant has copies of everything, held safely where you cannot destroy them. The Duke's gaze moved slowly to Eleanor, cold and assessing, and for a moment, she felt every instinct in her body urge her to step backward, away from the danger in his eyes. But she held her ground, meeting his stare without flinching, thinking of Charlotte's portrait in the locked wing, of the quiet grief that had lived in that room for years, and of every family the Duke had likely ruined in pursuit of his own ambition. You may destroy some things, Eleanor said, her voice steady, despite the fear coiling in her chest. But you cannot destroy what people already know, and what Judge Grant has already begun. Whatever power you have used to frighten people into silence, it ends here, with us. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he finally turned away, waving a dismissive hand toward the door. Get out of my house, he said quietly. Both of you. We will see how this plays out in the courts, and I promise you, I do not lose easily. They left the estate with the threat still hanging heavy in the air, but also with something they had not possessed before. An official acknowledgement from the court that the matter would now proceed openly, beyond the Duke's ability to bury it quietly. Over the following weeks, the case unfolded slowly but steadily, Judge Grant proving true to his word, building the legal process with careful precision, while ensuring Eleanor's mother and the household staff at Julian's estate remained protected from any further intimidation. The Duke did not surrender without resistance. He attempted, through various associates, to discredit the documents, to bribe witnesses, to delay proceedings through legal maneuvering designed to exhaust his opponents into abandoning the case entirely. But Judge Grant's reputation for fairness, combined with the undeniable authenticity of the original solicitor's records, slowly turned public, and legal opinion firmly against him. What had once been whispered rumors about the Duke's ruthless business dealings began to surface openly, other families coming forward once they saw someone finally willing to stand against him, each new voice adding weight to a case that had once rested on Eleanor and Julian alone. The final ruling came nearly 2 months after that tense confrontation in the Great Hall. The court declared Eleanor's family's original claim to the disputed lands legitimate, stripping the Duke of a significant portion of the fortune he had built upon the falsified record, and opening formal inquiries into several other troubling matters connected to Charlotte Aldridge's family and their sudden ruin years earlier. It was not a complete victory, for a man of the Duke's remaining wealth and connections would never face the full consequences his cruelty deserved, but it was enough to break the absolute power he had held for so long, and enough to finally bring a measure of justice to Charlotte's memory. Julian stood beside Eleanor in the quiet aftermath of the ruling, watching the setting sun cast long shadows across the estate that had once felt so unfamiliar to her, and now felt entirely like home. I did not expect this, he admitted softly. Not the ruling. I always believed we would win, eventually. I mean this. Us. I did not expect to find, in the middle of a plan built from grief and vengeance, something as real as what has grown between us. Eleanor turned to look at him, understanding at last the full weight of everything he had carried since the day she first arrived at his door, a stranger bound to him by necessity, who had slowly become something far more precious than either of them had anticipated. Neither did I, she said, but I am glad it did. That evening, for the first time since her wedding day, Eleanor walked through the once-locked wing of the house without fear, standing quietly before Charlotte's portrait with Julian beside her. Together they had finally opened the curtains, letting sunlight fill a room that had been kept in shadow for far too long, a small but meaningful act of remembrance for a woman whose death had set an entire chain of events into motion, and whose memory had finally, after so many years, found a measure of peace. Spring arrived slowly across the estate, softening the overgrown gardens Eleanor had first noticed on the day she arrived as a frightened bride. She had spent the winter months restoring them alongside Margaret, choosing new plantings with the same care Julian had once shown in preparing the house for her arrival, and the white roses with their faint blush of pink had multiplied along the garden wall until they seemed to glow in the early morning light. The Duke had retreated from public life following the ruling, his remaining influence a shadow of what it once had been, though Julian remained cautious, aware that a man who had spent his entire life wielding power rarely accepted its loss quietly. Judge Grant continued to monitor the situation from a careful distance, promising to alert them at the first sign of further trouble, but the months passed without incident, and slowly, cautiously, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that the danger truly had passed. Eleanor's mother came to live nearby not long after the ruling. Her health and spirits improved considerably, now that the threats against her had finally lifted. She visited often, delighting in the transformation she saw in her daughter, a young woman who had left for her wedding day pale with fear, and had somehow grown, through hardship neither of them could have predicted, into someone steady and certain of her place in the world. "I did not know what I was sending you into," her mother admitted one afternoon, as they walked together through the restored gardens. "I only knew we had no other choice, and I have carried the guilt of that decision every day since." "You do not need to carry it any longer," Eleanor said gently. "It was a hard beginning, but it led me somewhere I would not trade for anything now. I found more than safety in this marriage, Mother. I found a partner who trusted me with the truth, once he understood I could carry its weight, and a home I never expected to find so much comfort in." Julian, too, found a kind of peace he had not known since Charlotte's death, though he never forgot her, and never intended to. He kept her portrait in a place of honor within the restored wing, no longer locked away in shadow but open and remembered, a quiet tribute to the woman whose loss had first set him upon the long path that eventually led him to Eleanor. He spoke of her sometimes, in quiet evenings by the fire, and Eleanor listened without jealousy, understanding that love, real and lasting love, did not require the erasure of what came before it, only the honesty to hold both truths together without shame. Their marriage, born from necessity and calculation, had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated on that cold morning at the altar. Something built now on shared danger overcome, on truths finally spoken after years of careful silence, and on a trust that had grown stronger for having been tested so thoroughly. Eleanor often thought back to that first carriage ride, the silence between two strangers bound together by circumstances beyond their control, and marveled at how far they had traveled since, not merely in distance, but in understanding. One evening, as autumn began to color the estate's trees in shades of gold and amber, Julian found Eleanor in the library, curled into her favorite chair, with one of the books he had chosen for her all those months ago, back when she was still a stranger to him in every way but the ones that mattered most. "I have been thinking," he said, settling into the chair across from her, "about the day I first learned of your family's claim, and how carefully I calculated every step of bringing you into this house. I was so certain then that I understood exactly what I was doing, and exactly what this marriage would mean." "And now?" Eleanor asked, setting the book aside. "Now, I understand that the plan was never truly what brought us together," Julian said. "It only gave us the chance to find each other. Everything since has been entirely our own choosing, built from nothing but honesty and the courage to face difficult truth side by side. I chose you first for reasons of strategy, Eleanor, but I choose you now, every single day, simply because you are the woman I wish to spend my life beside, whatever challenges still lie ahead of us." Eleanor reached for his hand across the small space between their chairs, feeling the same steady warmth she had come to rely upon through every danger they had faced together. "I am glad," she said softly, "that the truth finally found its way to me. Whatever fear brought us together, I would choose this life again, knowing everything I know now." Outside, the last light of evening settled gently over the gardens she had helped restore, over the once locked wing now filled with sunlight and quiet remembrance, and over a marriage that had begun in obligation and fear, and had grown, through honesty, courage, and shared struggle, into something neither of them had ever expected to find, but both had come to treasure more than anything else in their lives.